Live. Hello, hello. Welcome to episode 7 of Method and Madness show. I'm joined by my guests, Larry and Dr. Onkar Ghate from the Ayn Rand Institute. We got a big topic here today. We're getting into systemic racism to carry on from our coverage of the topic of racism before. And given the connection of philosophy and ideas as being so important to this topic, and it's such a hard topic to navigate. I wanted to start at kind of, I guess, the beginning of this, interestingly enough, with some words from Stokely Carmichael, who is known as the starter of this, the coiner of the term, as he put it, institutional racism. But the ideas and the big thrust and essence of what we now use as systemic racism, many key in as his, and he actually graduated with a degree in philosophy from Howard. So I wanted to open up with reading the beginning of his book, Black Power. He also coined that term as well, to kind of set the stage for our discussion. And I'll quote, this is literally from the beginning of the book. He says, "What is racism? The word has represented daily reality to millions of Black people for centuries, yet it is rarely defined, perhaps just because that reality has been such a commonplace. By racism, we mean the predication of decisions and policies on considerations of race for the purpose of subordinating a racial group and maintaining control over that group. That has been the practice of this country towards the Black man. We shall see why and how." And here's where he goes in. "Racism is both overt and covert. It takes two related forms: individual whites acting against individual Blacks, and acts by the total white community against the Black community. We call these individual racism and institutional racism. The first consists of overt acts by individuals which cause death, injury, or violent destruction of property. This type can be recorded by television cameras. And the second type is less overt, far more subtle, less identifiable in terms of specific individuals committing the acts, but it is no less destructive of human life." Your thoughts on this kind of, I know it was lengthy, but your thoughts on this kind of opening discussion of racism and what he calls institutional racism, Dr. Gate?
I think there's a real phenomenon here. I wouldn't describe it exactly as there was just what you quoted from Carmichael, and many of the accounts and descriptions and characterizations of it I don't find compelling. Here it was overt and covert, and it was that it's very hard to identify when it's institutional. I don't think that's true. That is certainly, if there's a considerable extent of it, I don't think it's hard to identify. What you're identifying is somewhat different, but I don't think it's completely unrelated, and that you can't find any individuals who are engaged in it. So if you take institutional racism, sometimes it's systemic, right? But use the term he's using, institutional racism. It is true that institutions can have ways of functioning that you view as embedded in the institution. It's hard to identify the source of it. It's hard to identify exactly how it continues, but you can see people involved in its actual practice. So I think in the actual functioning of it, I think the easiest thing for people to think about, and take something outside of racism, that people talk about, that everybody who's worked at an organization has some experience with, which is that a company, but you can broaden it to an organization, has a corporate culture. And a corporate culture is this is how you're expected to behave in the institution. It might have a dress code that's never articulated. Like, you can't hand me page 8 of the employee handbook that says this is the dress code. But if you've been there a few months, there's a dress code. And yeah, on Fridays, people dress a little more informally, even if it's not stated as policy. And you get, okay, yeah, this is the practice. This is how things work. it has a culture about in meetings, you can challenge people who are higher up than, like, meetings are very egalitarian in that sense. Like anybody who has a good idea can just bring it up and so on. Other corporate cultures, it's much more hierarchical. It's like, don't speak when you're out of place. And again, you might not find a literal description of all of this in the employee handbook. But if you've been at the organization, you get to see, yeah, this is how it functions. These are some of its guidelines and its norms. And you can't even pinpoint like one individual. He's responsible for the company's corporate culture, though often it's the leaders in the organization who set the overall tone. And that's a real phenomenon. And everybody who's worked in an organization can say, yeah, there's a corporate culture here. I like it, or I don't like it, or I like some aspects of it. I don't like other aspects of it. It's a little too stodgy, or it's a little too egalitarian, or it's too hierarchical, and so on. And that's true about the functioning of organizations. What I don't think is true is the corporate culture does come from people's individual actions and individual choices, though it's hard to identify them. And it's hard to identify how it, like why it continues to perpetrate, or sorry, to perpetuate. So that's a phenomenon. And then there's a question for if there's been racism, can you have enduring things? So, and again, if you think of it like in the corporate culture, that this is still embedded, even if any individual, the leaders would say, no, like we reject that. And again, corporate culture, that happens, that the leaders will say, no, we want anyone to be able to speak up in meetings. Everybody's equal in the meeting who's invited to the meeting. So, but the actual practice is, no, you sort of get penalized if you're lower on the hierarchy and you speak up. It's you get a reputation for, yeah, this guy's a little hard to deal with. Maybe we shouldn't invite him to the next meeting. And all of a sudden you find yourself, yeah, I'm not being invited to meetings that I should be at. And it's not explicit, but it's nevertheless there, and it's present, and it has effects. So that's a real phenomenon. So, and the question is, how does it pertain to racism? Is it true of certain organizations that in effect they're functioning like this, even if people explicitly reject it?
What's interesting is this analogy you drew in his writing. He does a similar thing where he draws the comparison to businesses, and even further, kind of a colonial aspect, where the Blacks in America are almost a colony in itself, a subgroup under some type of, like you said, that kind of implicit control. It's covert. It's through the culture. And this he uses the term, this anti-Black behavior, this anti-Black sentiment that kind of pervades society and culture. Culture keeps coming up a lot. Is there any relation of cultures in behaviors? What do these concepts mean when in this conversation?
I mean, I'd have to read more about how he's specifically analyzing it. But cultures, it is used to designate a set of ideas, but also a set of values, and often a set of norms. So the expectations for how people will act, what's proper and improper behavior. And again, when you have ideas, values, and norms, they can be very explicit, very consciously formulated. You're violating one of the 10 commandments. It says, thou shalt not steal, and you're stealing. And it's very explicit, like these are what we're supposed to be doing. You're violating this. But it's also true that when you're thinking of a culture, and I used corporate culture, and so that's what culture there is designating, is there's a set of ideas, values, and norms that this corporation takes seriously. You can view these as ideas that the corporation accepts, values that it is pursuing and views as good, norms that it thinks people should function by. And again, they can be explicit in that when you join a company, there's often what they call an onboarding process, and you get things like, here's our basic mission, here's our strategic plan for the next 5 years or whatever, next 2 years. here's our employee handbook that has expectations. And you get like, these are some of the ideas and values and norms that govern. But you also, what you find if when working there, and again, that it's not explicitly stated, but obviously present and like operative, it has effects of other ideas, values, and norms that are important to the functioning of the company. And it's, again, like thinking of a culture more broadly. That's true if you talk about American culture versus European culture. For instance, if you read, Ayn Rand has an essay in Philosophy Who Needs It that talks about the difference between the kind of American aspects of American culture and European culture. And some of what she talks about is explicit. Like, I think an American and a European would say these things. And some things are not explicit. Some things they might not admit even or acknowledge that that's true of us if you told it to them explicitly. But her perspective is, like, if you observe how people in these two cultures operate, you can see these ideas, values, and norms functioning, even if they're not explicitly stated and acknowledged.
I know the last question was a little weird, but it was kind of to bring out this topic here, this kind of what seems like a very kind of hot point for a lot of people, where this definition battle, as I call it, kind of meets like people's real lives, this whole discussion over systemic racism and the role of philosophy even underlying it with the whole thing of definitions. When we go to draw this distinction between what is systemic racism and we talk about covert actions or overt actions of individuals and institutions, what is the almost threshold line to designate what is what, so that we can say something is this phenomena that we see where there's this culture causing potentially these negative effects? Because it seems the whole driving point is there's negative effects from it. What is the view, what does philosophy have to say about defining these points so we know what we're dealing with, how to properly say this is systemic racism, this is an individual, this is overt, this is covert?
Well, in this case, what's necessary is to think about the actual phenomenon and what your evidence is for concluding that something is operative, but not explicitly identified or acknowledged. Covert is not the best term, I think. So here's from one dictionary: covert is not openly practiced, avowed, engaged in, accumulated, or shown. But the examples they give, it's often like it's deliberate. So covert military operations is one. And it's like the military is deliberately hiding this because they want an element of surprise or for strategic reasons. But there's a deliberate element of hiding. Covert funding for the rebels is another example. And it's, again, like they don't want it to be openly known that we're doing this, so we're hiding it. And it puts synonyms: secret. And that, again, is like we're keeping stuff secret. But here, that's part of what I didn't like in the Carmichael, that overt and covert. There's an element that it's deliberate. But a corporate culture, it's not always that something's not explicitly stated. Isn't that they're trying to hide it. It's just it's not explicitly stated. And it's not only bad things. So a corporate culture, it can be that you can have a corporate culture that it's really encouraging employees to try stuff. And even if you fail, that's not a big deal, as long as like you really thought about it and you were trying something. And yeah, some things aren't going to work. That's the nature of experimentation. And you can have a corporate culture that's encouraged, even though it's not stated anywhere. But it's clear when you join there, yeah, this is encouraged. They want you to do this. You as an employee should take this kind of initiative. So, and you can have the opposite. You could have it explicitly stated. Oh, we want people to experiment and to take risks. It's okay if you fail. Just get back up on your horse and try something and learn from your mistakes. But in actual practice, that's not what happens. Like you fail at something and then you get reprimanded or you get a salary cut or whatever. And the employees quickly learn that what this talk about we encourage experimentation. It's just hot air. But the covert, so something can be implicit and it can be good. And it's not like deliberately trying to hide it. It's just, it's not easy to state everything explicitly about these are the ideas we accept, the values, the norms that guide us. So that's, I like implicit better for, and that's a term that Ayn Rand often uses, and it doesn't have any connotation of you're trying to hide it, not stated or something.
I wonder if this is an interesting connection to get your view on this. Do you think the question of that's always kind of in the debate or the conversations in the center of it, do you think the question of does systemic racism exist, is that a good question? Is that a valid, is that you're already shaking your head, can you?
Yeah, I don't, because it's often, I mean, so is it a good question? In certain contexts, it's a good question, but as it's used today, I think it's much too easy to go from, yeah, there's systemic racism to we've got to redo our institutions, we've got to change everything. And it would really matter, where do you find institutional racism and what institutions? What is it that you're actually finding? Like, what is it that you're finding that there's, and if you think of it, is it implicit, like there's an implicit way of functioning that's not right, we need to change it. You would have to know the specifics of that to know what's appropriate to change it. It's rarely, let's burn down this institution, or like let's, even if you thought, like if for the police, there's some element that there's some, in their functioning and conduct as institutions, there's some element of racism. It doesn't follow that the solution is defund the police or something like that. You would have to know what it is, how it seems to be functioning in order to figure out like what would be the best way to correct this. And all that kind of work, I think, it's right now in the discussion, at least, is being glossed over, because it's just like, oh, it's a question of our society or our culture either is kind of saturated with institutional racism or it isn't. But like those aren't the two alternatives.
So even before even discussing about like their conception of like what they deem as systemically racist or where it is in these particular institutions, I would have to ask the question, Onkar, if you were building, a country, what would you say would be the defining line or the defining characteristics that determines a country systemically racist? What would those things look like? What would it have to be determined systemically racist as opposed to, oh, just a society just has their own, racist beliefs as culturally? What would be the defining line between those two things?
It would have to have political legal expression. So if you think, like, if you want clear examples where there was systemic racism, so systemic comes from system. So you have to know what system are you referring to. Institutional comes from institution. You have to know what institution you're referring to and how you think it's embedded in its functioning. But if you take, say, America pre-Civil War, or if you take South Africa apartheid, those are explicit legal political systems based on race, racial classifications. And there, it's true that what you're dealing with is not just individual racism, that there's individual people who have racist beliefs or a whole racist ideology. What you're dealing with is these ideas embedded in the political legal arena, so in government, in law, and it makes a huge difference to people. Like, would you rather live in a society where there's individual racists, but it's not enacted into law, so you can still vote, you can intermarry, and so, versus, yeah, there's a lot of individual racism and it's enacted into law, so you cannot vote or you cannot intermarry, and so the second is worse. When it becomes institutionalized in the political legal system, is worse than when it's not. If the political legal system treated the individuals as equal before the law, that's vastly superior to when it's not just individual racism, but also you don't have any legal or political recourse because the political and legal system is embedded with racist ideas and enacted into law.
What do you mean by like institutional racism as opposed to systemic racism? Are you kind of saying that the system is backing the institutions, or the institutions are the owners of the institutions are just expressing their own racist beliefs through their own personal policies?
If you're using these terms, systemic would be broader than institution. So a system in this context would include a bunch of institutions. So if you think of the political legal system, there's a bunch of institutions that comprise that. If you think, say, in the US, and you say that this has been whether you talk about in the Jim Crow era, or you talk about pre-Civil War with slavery, to say that it's systemic is there's a whole bunch of institutions. So it's in Congress, it's in the courts, it's in the whole voting system, and there's different institutions. It's not just the Supreme Court, but the lower courts, and those are a bunch of institutions that together make up the political legal system. And when you're saying it's systemic, it's that it's the whole system, which includes individuals, but crucially includes a whole bunch of institutions, versus saying, so there's a difference between saying the police are systemically racist in the US. And that would mean like all the major police departments, and there's an element of racism in their functioning, versus saying that the LAPD during the 70s there was institutional racism. That's a very different claim than saying it's systemic across the policing in the US.
Kind of on that note you just said there, because I think this is like where a lot of the fight kind of breaks out, so to say. When you, for example, you talked about the police there, or these pre-Civil War examples, but mainly the police one. Is it that the police are acting on some prescription for in I guess, for lack of the police guidelines, like somehow this is what they're commanded to do in their job guidelines, or versus, this is what they have chosen to do. And it seems like some of the whole push is against the way you just defined it. The whole push is to blur this line between what's in the guidelines or the rules and procedures of the system, and what's kind of even sometimes being done by some of the actors within the system.
So it can be that there's an attempt to blur the lines, but if you're trying to think clearly about the issue, those are different things. And when you so it's helpful just to think about institutions and how they function in regard to various things. And when you're dealing with a heated issue like racism, it's useful to think about other kinds of examples of how institutions function. And again, you can have that it's the people involved, and it's more conscious, it's written down in some of the guidelines and so on. So you can think, again, if you use a corporate culture, you can think of a corporate culture like, I don't like Apple's corporate culture. And it might be like some of the things they're explicitly stated, and like, this is how Apple runs, and I'd rather work at Google. And people leave even like good businesses because they just don't like the corporate culture and they want to be in a different one. Some of that can be written down, some cannot be written down. But what's crucial here is, what's your evidence for thinking that this is part of how this institution is functioning? And so if you think like a police department at some point in time is functioning in a partly racist way, you need evidence for that. And part of the evidence might be some of the leadership is racist, and they find statements or emails and so on that do indicate that there's a racist element in how they view the world. Or it can be that it's more just in terms of the functioning, it's not explicitly stated so much, but if you're looking at the actual function, you see an element of it. Or it could be that neither of those are present.
the note of evidence, what I find interesting in a lot of the conversations had on this topic, a lot of the evidence presented are like, I guess, statistics of consequences is the best way I could put it. Like statistics of concept, not necessarily some study of what the cops' guidelines are and then what they did because of those guidelines. It's more like, you know, we see X amount of people at this disproportionate rate in prison, and then that's our evidence. Is there something to say on that? Because almost the way you presented kind of this threshold line, this dividing line would make it so that evidence like that is almost inadmissible if what we're looking for is to blame the system, right? Or its guidelines or procedures to then present, oh, there's some statistics of consequences here. That's not actually evidence in this case.
So what are you saying? I didn't quite follow what you were saying. So that that kind of evidence wouldn't qualify. What's that kind?
Where someone, for various examples, like we see disproportionate home rates here. That's systemic racism. We see disproportionate health rates, pregnancy, poverty, wealth, you know, all the current examples that you typically hear, these kind of and they because you mentioned evidence. I was trying to present evidence that I think is usually given, and it seems like how you defined our terms here, those things would almost be inadmissible as evidence if what we're looking for is something that's in the procedures or guidelines. It's almost like, why would you present, you know, statistics of this consequence here?
I wouldn't put it that they're inadmissible, but they're nowhere close to making a case. So another way of putting it is that it would be weird if you said that, look, this institution is functioning in a certain racist way. Doesn't mean it's saturated with racism and so, but it in a certain way. And think of some of the examples that are brought up in regard. Now, you can question you can even question the examples, and is this actually what was found out, and so on. And take something similar to racism but different. So there's a claim. Now, you would have to really investigate even the evidence for this, but a claim that symphony orchestras had a bias against women. And again, it wouldn't, like, if you take out their brochure for what they're about, they wouldn't say, like, we don't admit women, or we don't. But so it's not explicitly stated. But when you looked at their actual hiring practices and who they want to bring into the orchestra, and so it's the argument was it's skewed. And part of the evidence was when you make someone play behind a screen, so the orchestra members hearing it don't know if it's male, female, the person's tall, short, or whatever. They just are hearing the set because that's supposedly what they're supposed to be paying attention to. It changed of who they evaluated as better or worse, and the bias against women disappeared. And again, you would have to look at the actual research for this, how these studies were conducted. Was it really blind in this way? Is it true that when it wasn't blind, it was really skewed against women? So, but just take that as that's an example that's commonly given. So it would be weird if you said, yeah, there's a bias against women in symphony orchestras, but when you look around all symphony orchestras, all the conductors are women. There's 70% women in there. Like, it would be, how does this result match up with what you're claiming? But you can't do the reverse and just say, look, it's 70% men, and therefore that's proof that it's bias against women. You have to show that their actual process that's leading to this outcome is biased against women. It's not like if women never apply to symphony orchestras, so the people they're selecting from, like, it's 90% male and the orchestras are 70-30, then you'll start to wonder, like, is it really in their selection process they're biased? You might think, no, there's something that biased preventing women from even applying to, but you wouldn't think in the process of selecting it's biased. And that's what you have to look at the actual causality, not just the result. And that's why the result by itself doesn't tell you what's going on.
mean, it seems that they take it seems like they take like race as this equal playing field, where if we say there is a white person as a doctor and there's a black person as a doctor, they have the same label as a doctor, so that we would expect the same type of outcomes to happen. But when we see a kind of a disparity within kind of, the healthcare industry, then we can take that as self-evident that it has to be racist because they're both doctors, so we should expect them to have the same type of outcome. And even people like Thomas Sowell points out that there's certain variables that distinguish these type of people internally. So one might have differing backgrounds of neighborhood or education. The other one, kind of the differing backgrounds, is the same thing. The type of family that they had, the type of household that they grew up in. So what would be like how do I put this? What would be kind of their thinking process to do the jump from disparities that automatically translate to systemic or institutional racism?
I mean, it will vary from who you're looking at, but from the things I've read, there's at least two. So one is, I think, there's at least three. One is dishonest. So one is they've already got their conclusion and they're just fishing around for things that seem to support it. So, and this is like, it's a bogus use of evidence. When they bring in there's disparities, and it can be disparities in regard to race, disparities in regard to sex, disparities in regard to various other kinds of characteristics like that. And they just use the fact that there's some statistically worrisome. So it's just like it's not. Often the conception of equity now is like if there's 25% women in this, then it should be in terms of leadership, it should be 25% in terms of this role and that role, which does not follow if. And they know it doesn't follow, but they're using it because it's helping to win the argument. That's dishonest. You're not actually trying to figure out what's true. A different and less troublesome, like morally troublesome phenomenon, I think, is because this kind of analysis is all over the place. There's people who too quickly think the explanation has to be racism or sexism or what have you, because that's what they're being told in effect, without really thinking more carefully that, these kind of social phenomena are very complex and there could be different causes. And have we really ruled out other causes? This is part of what Thomas Sowell's work, I think, he's pointing out that no, like you're looking at a complex phenomenon. There's a lot of variables, as you put it. You have to really study like what seems to be happening, what are the variables that are driving it, and what are the ones that aren't. And you could quickly jump to a conclusion, but it would be the wrong conclusion. And people are jumping to conclusions here, and they're being encouraged to, I think. And a third is just to not really be able to know how to analyze these things. And you're just going along with what everybody is saying, and this is what seems to be, and you haven't really even thought. It's not even that you're too quickly jumping to a conclusion. You're not even really thinking about it. You're just echoing what people are saying. And these kinds of things, they warrant real investigation and real study. So like we should take seriously if there's evidence that there might be, say, racial biasing in a police department. That should be taken seriously. But part of taking it seriously is to do a real investigation, not do bogus things like here's some stats and therefore we know what the cause of it is and so on. It's to do a real investigation. So, for instance, I read the Michael Ferguson, the FBI investigations. So that the Michael Brown. And there were FBI investigations, and that the story that was told about Michael Brown and his killing is wrong. That what happened, the way it's kind of popularly portrayed in the media, is wrong. But the FBI also investigated the Ferguson Police Department and found, from the report, they think they found evidence of some racism in the conduct of the department. And that goes back years and years. And that's a serious thing. Like, if we have a police department, and you don't have to say all police in America or like this, but if you have a police department that you think it's operating in a partially racist way, that's a real problem that we should take seriously. But it seriously means, this is why we have a whole legal system. It means actually doing the work to figure out what is actually happening. And if something bad is happening, to then correct it. But you can't. Imagine if you're on trial for theft or murder, and you have juries and a judge who they just jump to conclusions about, like, that's not how you want it to operate. And the same is true here.
I'm glad you said the court thing, because that's why I kind of used the wording of inadmissible, because that's kind of how I think about it. But this whole conversation, wow, I got really excited there. This whole
I got something too, man.
Yeah, this whole kind of part of the conversation that deals with who we're kind of looking to blame, who's to blame, and what we're gonna do about the blame. I find that a lot of the evidence, as you kind of noted, it is a serious issue, and I wanted to kind of get your kind of statements on how not properly identifying the real issue in some ways does make it worse. Like, for me, I see a problem in when we mischaracterize things as systemic racism or racism, whether it's or dealing with institutions, or if this business is racist. We kind of what generally happens is they make it into this big kind of massive, almost they want it to be global cause, some revolutionary cause, and it misses the actual trouble. It provides mechanisms for it to be hidden over, and kind of the individuals involved missed out that need to be to have the rights, the wrongs against them righted, and the wrong people go unpunished. Have you seen anything like this? Has this something similar to what I described? Have you witnessed something like that?
Well, what would you take as examples of that? So, yeah, I do think there's that kind of phenomenon.
Yeah. To stay connected with, I guess, what you said the Ferguson thing. They have something called the Ferguson Effect, in fact, where, and I know some of the claims in what's part of the Ferguson Effect are, some can be weird. There's debate over them, but generally speaking, the idea is that the whole claim of some systemic racism, like overwashing these departments, has created this almost environment, this almost cop culture, or this, and even cop policy making culture, our whole, or legal policy making culture, crime policy culture, of backing off, of making laws that in effect, since they're so concerned about consequences, actually make crime, let crime proliferate, provide incentives for certain crimes to be committed, or certain penalties to become less. And that in effect kind of sends a signal like, hey, we're they're letting people go for these things. The laws have changed, so it's easier to get out of these certain, and there's people who write on this stuff. I know Heather McDonald and Thomas Sowell, but is that an example that you think?
Yeah, and that something like that is bound to happen. This is when you have things that aren't true that are being propagated, people, so what that means that they're not true and being propagated and accepted is people are accepting things that aren't true. And so they're treating something that's false as though it's true, and that's going to shape their actions. So, and it can be a variety of things. And again, you would have to investigate to see like what is actually happening. How is this actually shaping people's ideas and conduct? But one plausible thing is that, yeah, police, if they're going to be accused of racism when there's not evidence for it, but it's going to be taken as obvious, and look, the suspect was black and you mistreated him, even though they're overlooking, well, that it's happened with white suspects and so on. And maybe it's a problem, like they use too much force, but it's not really racism. It's just they use too much force against everybody. But if you misdiagnose the problem, that has consequences. And one consequence you can see would be that police are because they don't want to be falsely accused of racism, will when they're making decisions, and particularly this occurs at the margin. So it's, yeah, maybe I shouldn't intervene here, or maybe I shouldn't do anything. And that, when you think of it cumulatively, that has impacts. Another impact might be that, so the more you paint a false light that America, like we've made no progress since the 60s, the more you disempower people who might actually be victims of some racism, but it's not as bad as the 60s, and you should venture out and try to succeed. You're not going to meet the same opposition that you met in the 60s, not anywhere close. And it, like, that has an impact, and likely has an impact on people's motivation and just willingness to venture out. And that's, again, because you're painting something that's false, but treating it as true, and that has repercussions. The reason you want to get this right is because it matters. It matters to get it right, and it matters if you get it wrong.
I wanted to get your commentary, kind of in light of what you just said, and the common retort that I think is the aim of it is to go with your point of when you don't have the truth conceptualized, you end up doing bad things, such as the affirmative action point is usually kind of like tried to purport as a kind of flip on the head, like the people purporting that they're against systemic racism, they're misdiagnosing, and then they're actually doing something that is essentially, or in kind of more in the light of what systemic racism is, which is by government action, by law, implementing things that discriminate on that basis. Do you see stuff like that? Do you agree with that kind of phenomena, that kind of thing?
Yes. So is there an element of support for affirmative action that relies on a view that that America is a more racist place or more racist culture than I think it actually is in the 21st century? Yes, I think it gains some support. There's other people who are pushing affirmative action for other reasons. So I don't think it's only that, but that does play a role.
I do like how you emphasized earlier the importance of doing an actual investigation to discover the causes of disparities, that it is complex issues, and kind of integrating that with how some take it that disparities or racial disparities automatically equal discrimination, and therefore there should be laws and policies stopping that. This is a kind of a point that I wanted to tie in when we did talk about like the courts, is that there are cases that are known as prima facies, where it's essentially that discrimination isn't automatically proven, but it's rather taken as for granted or the given, and the other side has to prove that they aren't racist in order to win the court. So an example is that Thomas Sowell points out an example in one of his books. He says Sears was kind of taken to court because they believed that they were performing women discrimination. And Sears went through years of trying to beat that case, but they never provided one female who was a victim of discrimination. And I want to tie that in as kind of the whole entire thing is that when people kind of take it axiomatically that it's discrimination, it's racist or whatnot, that can cause court cases that are illogical, and that doesn't have proper, I would say, evidence or a judiciary process, you could say. That's a better term to put it that way.
Yes. So that's an issue of the burden of proof. And if you make it that we know the cause absent somebody showing, no, that wasn't the cause, you're placing the burden of proof illegitimately. So when people bring up there's some disparity about the women versus men in management or along racial lines or something like that, it's their responsibility to show that what the cause of this is illegitimate. And even let's put it in the context of government institutions, because they certainly should not be able to discriminate on the basis of sex or on the basis of race. It's a different issue when you're dealing with private organizations. It's often wildly irrational for them to do it, but there's a different issue of whether legally they should be prevented from doing it. But government certainly should be. So you can't just take it as, look, we know the cause is X unless you prove otherwise. A burden of proof should be on the person asserting something. So they're asserting that not only that there's this disparity, but that it's caused by racism or sexism. It's their obligation to prove that. And you can't, our legal system would be so dramatically different if what the norm was when people asserting it was, okay, this is what I assert, prove it ain't so. Our system would be so radically different. And it's not like the police say, look, we think this guy is guilty of murder, so we're putting him in jail. We won't put him in jail if you prove it ain't so. It's no, the police have to prove, like, here's our evidence to say this guy committed a theft or a murder and should be charged and locked away. They have to prove it. And it's the same for any claim in the legal system. If you're making a claim, it's your response. I mean, and legally, the legal system should put the responsibility on the person who's asserting it. And if they can't prove it, it's not Sears' obligation to prove, like, here's our 75-year history of hiring people. This is how we made the decisions for everybody. Where do you see the sexism? It's not their responsibility now to try to prove their 75-year history doesn't have any sexism in it. It's, if you're making that allegation, it's your responsibility to prove it.
I wanted to kind of, I guess, zoom out here to a more philosophical space here, because last time we talked a lot about racism and its connection to determinism and collectivism, a lot of this thought. And I wanted to know how that kind of lends its way to this conversation. These aspects of determinism and collective, do these concepts play any part in people's conceptions or misconceptions about systemic racism? Do you see any of these? Because I think Ayn Rand talks a lot about philosophy. I'll set this up. She talks about a lot about philosophy being the main driver, a major causal factor in these movements, these ideas going around society. That's why I found it an interesting non-coincidence that Stokely Carmichael, this guy who's the real progenitor of all this kind of thought, and his thoughts get really into capitalism and stuff like that as well. But his major thought, he is a graduate of philosophy. He's a product of, 1970s philosophy, a product of the civil rights movement. He's hailed as one of the youngest ones being a part of it. So he's literally he was like the youngest mind, someone who at one point started to disagree with Martin Luther King's philosophy, his approach. He disagreed in some ways with other peak contemporaries of his that are now heroes. He's kind of the guy who he went into the wayside, but not really. So his story is very interesting. What do you think? What are the more philosophical concepts? How are they playing a role here in this whole idea?
The collectivism, I think, is the most evident one of what we've been talking about, because part of when we say that you need evidence, and part of when we're talking about a corporate culture doesn't exist absent the individuals. So there's a difference between saying it's not explicitly stated, it's more implicit, and there's ideas, values, and norms embedded in how people are functioning, but it's still embedded in how individuals are functioning. And so the evidence you would need is at the level of, this is what individuals are doing, and it's wrong. And so even something like, I brought up the symphony orchestras and their hiring. It's like you have to point to actual symphony orchestras, the individuals involved in the hiring. And so and how they're making decisions, and then show that it's different if it's blind versus they see who the performer is and so on. But it's all at the level of individuals. When part of, I think, the prevalence of the use of terms like institutional racism or systemic racism is to think of it as it's a collective, and it's some kind of collective organization that is different from, and in some sense, because they're stressing like this is the primary in regard to racism, it's different from the individuals and in some ways is more important and transcends the individuals. But there's no such thing as a corporate culture absent the individuals in the company acting so on. And that's what you need to look at. So, but collectivism trains you to think, no, you can look at the collective, which is somehow different than just a group of individuals. And to really understand the function, you have to look at how the individuals are functioning in that group. So it's true that like, when you're looking at a corporate culture, you're looking at individuals as they're functioning in the company. They might do very different things at home. They might do very different things if they're on a sports team or whatever. But when they're at work at this company, this is how they're acting. But it's still at the level of individuals. And the more you obliterate that, the more, when you think about the causality, you think of it very differently. And you think you can just talk at the level of collectives and never get down to individual action. And it's not important that you haven't got down to individual action.
Yeah, as a personal note, to me, when I kind of got introduced to this is one of the big topics that led me all the way to Ayn Rand's ideas, kind of researching this one. It always seemed to me like if what we're looking for, I was always on the look for, okay, where's the law? Where does it say it in the law? And then who's the individuals that put it in the law? And who's the individuals that openly wrote that they agreed with it? That's, in terms of evidence, that's what I was always looking for, and dismayed that I didn't find it. And that's kind of my own personal note. I think, Larry, you had something more to say.
I mean, my kind of thing was the same thing. I mean, we met up on the same type of topic. We met up on systemic racism and kind of found Ayn Rand along
this is our inception topic. But
when you say that, you said something like, I was disappointed or dismayed that I didn't find it. Didn't find it in regard to what or where?
Perfect. I love that you pressed me on this. I didn't find it in the modern claims. In all the claims that are like people take as self-evident. Yeah, I mean, this actually going on that trail gave me a deeper understanding, I feel, of this topic, because when you actually look at, okay, that was systemic racism. They had it in the law. They had it on the books. It was in the Confederate Constitution. They said there's writings and arguments why they were doing it. It wasn't just that we found out they were racist through conversation and then they finagled it into the law under ambiguous wording. No, they said their point. They wanted this to be their point, and they fought for that wording. They fought for that guideline in their society. So when we say things like systemic racism, when we're going to make that claim, to me, it seemed more, it really became clear what's our line here. And people kind of scoff at the idea that it's just in the law. What do you mean, man? You just want it in the law. They had to say the little words. But sometimes I'm kind of like, yes, because that's really what matters to evaluating this and then going down the trail of finding out who exactly is to the blame, the individuals minds and ideas at work here, and who kind of, and to say on the opposite point, it gives you appreciation of the positive elements that were going against these ideas and the philosophy that gave rise to fighting against it. I'm sure you have a little bit more to say on that.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I pressed you on that is what's important, and I think if I'm getting right the way you guys are describing your journey here, is you do find the evidence for certain cases and in certain places. And so then there's the question of, if you're not finding it for some of these modern claims, shouldn't you have a different evaluation of these claims? And when you're seeing the same blanket evaluation, you have to start wondering, are they really actually trying to figure this out? And I would put at least a third category, not that these are exhaustive, but so you're putting it in terms of whether you're looking at the Confederacy and its constitutions and so on, that it's explicitly dedicated, we want to preserve the institution of slavery, so on. Or if you look in the Jim Crow, it's pretty explicit of how they think of colored people and so on. There is the phenomenon that when this is socially receding, that is, when it's less and less acceptable culturally and socially to be so blatant about it, that there will be more hidden forms. And this is true. Like there is this element of covert that they're trying to do it, but they're saying it in ways that are meant to be code in effect. And so, something take for the kind of Jim Crow era, the presence of all these Confederate monuments, much of that is covert. It's like we can't explicitly put it in racial terms. So we'll put it as we're just celebrating our heritage and our past and traditions. And when you read about the kind of the people behind resurrecting the lost cause, I think much of it is racist, but they won't now so explicitly say it. And that is a phenomenon. But that, again, you need like to investigate it and have evidence for thinking that's what's going on. Or something like the research into redlining, and so government funding of that. And so it's, again, you have to think like, yeah, that you can imagine something like that happening, that it's along racial lines, but maybe not as openly admitted because it's losing favor in the country and culturally. And you have to be open to, like, you can find things like that. But it has to be like, what's the evidence for that this red line and so on was along racial lines? And you have to, like, that has to be argued.
I wanted to say something on what you just said. It sparked my memory of kind of how the role plays in what our dominant ideas are at the time of when we're doing this. Like Ms. Rand spoke on what she kind of disagreed with the civil rights movement, right? These aspects of it, right? And redlining is one of those topics that's also attached to this whole kind of story of how we got these civil rights and how society welcomed and treated Black people in it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And redlining has to do with housing, for example. Right. And there also is this conversation of public and private property and who can and cannot discriminate. And I just wanted to say, when you talk about, going on an honest search, you'll even find recently I found stuff about how the civil rights movement in 1866, for example, the earlier or 1865, the earlier civil rights movement involved a lot of more that conception of we're trying to stop this legal apparatus, these governmental apparatuses from working against people and provide property rights for people. And you see, as time goes on, though, that shift in ideas to where civil rights also involves this idea of getting, governmental government to step into that private realm. Mm-hmm. And I wanted you to speak on this, how do we kind of view this change over time and still hold on to these proper elements? Because over time, it seems like philosophically it changed, but it still tried to maintain that we don't like racism. We want to maintain civil rights, but there's still this discrepancy on this issue.
That is occurring in a wider context. So if you leave aside the issue of racism for a moment, there's a massive shift intellectually away from America's founding towards new ideas. So at the time of America's founding, the thinking about rights includes property rights as an essential element, that you can't really understand rights if you think, oh no, there's human rights, or civil rights, but they don't include the right to property. And in 1865, and when you're reading, I mean, pre-Civil War, post-Civil War, there's still a number of people who have some understanding of the American ideal. And I would put someone like Frederick Douglass as this, and that he understands the importance of property rights. They understand part of what was so abominable about slavery is the denial, I mean, certainly the denial of your autonomy as a person, but also that you can't own anything. You can't build, and you can't build wealth upon wealth and so on. And that this is what, to be free and equal, this is part of what it would be, to be able to actually have property, own property. But the whole intellectual world is turning against property rights. This is, I mean, Marx and communism is the most well-known now into the 20th and 21st centuries. But the whole 19th century has a whole bunch of collectivists and socialists who say the crucial thing that we have to get rid of is property. And Marx is one of them. What we have to do is abolish private property. And so when you move from 1865 to 1920 to 1940 to 1960, there's less and less respect for and appreciation of property rights. And so it's not surprising that you also see that in the civil rights and the thinking about race in America and the discrimination against blacks and other people, but I mean, primarily. So I wouldn't pin it on them, like that they're the instigators of this. They're rather followers, I think, on this issue. It's still not for, I mean, you still have to look individually at the figures and think, why are they against property rights? And it can be partly, well, everybody is, and partly they have an animus as well against property rights. There's often, unfortunately, an anti-capitalist element in a lot of this thinking, including, I think, in the civil rights, that capitalism's part of the problem when it's actually part of the solution. But yeah, it's I think of it more as a consequence than the initiation by these thinkers.
I know it was a weird setup, but I'm glad you mentioned the capitalist kind of elements of it, because I found it interesting, the notion of when we were closer to this, I guess what you could say, a more clear conception of capitalism, you know, so to speak, the civil rights movement was more in that capitalist type thrust, and the kind of the ideas to block off such a thing as redlining were already there. In fact, right before it happened. And then as you see this kind of bad view towards property, it's almost as if the view of government being able to encroach upon property, of private property, is what allows for something like redline. It's kind of, in a way, it facilitates it. If I get the thrust of the Color of Law book about redlining, for example, that much of this was done through governmental apparatuses and what the government made room for, and through the very solid fact that the government had just taken over the housing market in a major way.
Yes, that's certainly part of the conditions, and that it can be so widespread is because there was so much government involvement in it. But what is also true is, so when they say there hasn't been a racial reckoning in America, that's not true, so bluntly stated. But has there been a full racial reckoning? I think the answer to that is no. So it's bizarre to think of the Civil War and then the civil rights battles in the 50s and the 60s as not part of a racial reckoning. So if you just say there's been no racial reckoning, that's bizarre. But what should have happened, this should have happened after the Civil War, but it should have also happened in the 60s. What was clear, so let's just take the 60s, is that you had a lot of government support for racist policies, racist laws, and so on. And there is such a process as you can put it in different ways, but I'll put it as decontaminating a government when it's been kind of imbued with this kind of perverse ideology. We had this perspective, for instance, in Japan. It's not enough just to, okay, now we've defeated them. And if we said, okay, now you just all go back into government and do your thing, even if they don't explicitly now say the ideas that they held before, that's going to have consequences in how they act, how they make decisions. And if you give them decisions about housing policy now, because government's involved in that, and you've got people who have this kind of view, they might be now more reluctant to express it, but they'll still try to enact it in various ways. Like we had this perspective, that's what would happen in Japan if we don't really try to remove these people from wielding power and putting different people and so on. And the same, we had a perspective in Germany that you need to do this, that it's not, you can't just say, okay, now we've defeated you, now you all go back into government and do your thing. Like that, and not enough of that happened in the US, I think, in the aftermath of the 60s. I mean, when you have governors and states calling up the troops and so on, police forces to defend this kind of discrimination, you've got a problem that's not easy to solve. And you can't just pretend, okay, now we've passed some laws and that settles everything. That's not how things work.
It seems like when you discuss how they're trying to implement certain laws to give certain people power, and they're being discreet about it, they're not making it explicit that it's here's race, this is the race we're trying to benefit, or this is the race we're trying to hurt. It seems like they're affecting certain categories in which that race resides in. So if I give an example, if somebody makes a law that says nobody wears blue shirts. Sorry, Dr. Ghate, but nobody wears blue shirts. And we see that the majority of people who wear blue shirts happens to be black people. Well, we can see and conclude, well, obviously the motivation for this law has to be racist. But the motivation for that law is itself not the system or the law itself, right? So the law itself would be discriminatory against blue shirts, but it wouldn't be discriminatory against black people per se. You can say the motivations for that law will be, but the law itself, no.
Though the effects would still, I mean, if people don't adjust and start wearing different color shirts and so on, that the effects will be disproportionate on that racial group. And so they can succeed or partly succeed in who they're trying to target. So and that's why they're doing it. Like if it didn't work at all, then it's much less plausible that they would do it. But because it doesn't directly target you, there's often things you can do to try to get around the law. Like if it penalizes you because you have black skin, there's nothing you can do. But if it penalizes you because you've got blue shirts, then yeah, you can start wearing different color shirts and say, well, now don't I qualify for this? And so, but the fact is that kind of thing does happen. Again, you need evidence that it's happening in this case and so on, but that people do things that are in effect proxies. This exists for race, but it exists for religion. It's one of the reasons the Supreme Court looks at this kind of thing. They look at it's, okay, yeah, you're not directly penalizing a religion, but you're saying that your businesses have to be open on Sunday. And it's the Catholics who want to close on Sunday. So you're really targeting them. And that's valid that the court says that we're striking down this law because its actual motivation, even not explicitly stated, it's pretty clear that its motivation is to penalize a certain group that the government has no legitimacy in penalizing.
And what me and Ibis has observed time and time again after, having conversations and discussions with those who believe in systemic racism is the merging of a law and the motivations with it, because they'll point out, well, this president in private letters says this and they said that, and that's what motivated them to do the law. And then we'll retort back, well, that's not systemic racism. We could say that it has the consequences of it, but it does not affect the race itself. And we could categorize that law as just bad law in general, just bad law.
I was going to ask you, Dr. Ghate, would you say there's a valid thing in calling those racist effects? Because a lot of people would say, hey, those what you just described are just what we want to say that they're racist effects. And that's exactly what we're arguing about, that there's racist effects there. But is it valid, especially given this is a little bit harkening back to our conversation on racism as an ideology and what does it mean to be a racist? But
I mean, it can be racist effects, but the motivation, I think, is important. It's true that it's not sufficient evidence to that you find some private statement from one of the lawmakers or the president who signed it into law that indicates a certain motivation. That's not sufficient to say that was the motivation for this law and what's leading to it. But if you really had evidence that the motivation was racist and they're using some kind of proxy to do this because they can't explicitly say what we're trying to do, then it is, I would call the effects racist, but even the law that it has, or at least a racist component to it, that's part of what's motivating it, even if it's not explicitly stated in the law.
I have the most interesting example, but go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say this is a real life. And I guess I get your thoughts on this one. It so happened, dang, I used to know this by heart, but the first minimum wage laws were just that, in the sense that if you look at the actual congressional testimony and debate that happened over the laws, you can see them saying, we want these minimum wage laws so these Black guys can stop coming from the South and taking our jobs. And I want to say that's a perfect example of what you're talking about. That, by the way, most people who are talking about systemic racism nowadays don't like that example at all, because it's the inception of minimum wage in our country was used for just that. And to go a little further, economists and people making policy knew just that this was going to hurt Black people bad. And oh, well, they almost used it as economic eugenics at one point.
Yeah. Even further, the point, it was used in Africa to discriminate against certain tribes as well. So it's not just an even American thing.
Yeah. So part of the reason the motivation's relevant there, you can have this kind of motivation, and you would, again, in terms of the effects, it might fall along racial lines, but that's not actually what was motivating it. So imagine in that kind of example, what they're trying to do is just keep out, and they might conceptualize it as poor people or the trash. Yeah. And they don't really care if it's the color of the person's skin, if they're Black, white. We don't want these people who don't have any money. They're not sophisticated. They don't have education. So imagine it's we don't want immigrants. And it's in a period of time where the immigrants coming to America, they have nothing. They come with and this was literally true. They come with the shirt on the back. That's all they have. It's on. And they might not have many skills, but we'll pass minimum wage and they won't be able to work for minimum. They're not that productive yet. So we're stopping those people from coming. And it might turn out that it's not, the poor people are also colored. So when you look at it, it's keeping colored people out. But what they're actually trying to do is just keep out poor people. And it so happens that most of them are colored, and it's still a bad motivation, but the motivation is not a racial motivation. It's a motivation like they don't like poor people. And they don't want their neighborhoods, as they would see it, infested with these people. And so we have to keep them out. Here's a way of keeping them out. And so that's why the motivation is important for understanding the law and what's actually passed. But yeah, for minimum wage, it was that it's on racial lines, and I would call that a racial law, even though in its written out form, it doesn't mention race.
Super chats now?
Yeah, super chats now.
All right, great. So
I think we'll have some
a $9 donation from Mary, and she says, is it racism to favor or benefit someone based on their race?
And then the last part's for you.
So instead of being negative towards a race, it's just being, beneficial to them just because they're a race.
Yes. I mean, so if you're ascribing significance to race, then that's what racism is. So the reason it's bad is because this characteristic is not significant. You should not judge people based on their genetic lineage. And that can include the skin color they've inherited. But as we talked about, when we talked about a proper conception of racism, that's really just one form of a more general attitude of judging people based on their heredity, based on where they descended from and what they've supposedly inherited and so on. And the reason that's wrong is because it's wrong about how to think about individual human beings. These are not significant characteristics. And the fact that somebody's father has a certain skin color or someone's father was a murderer doesn't tell you anything about the son. And so to judge either negatively or positively, and if you remember some of the examples of Ayn Rand's were positive ones, like you should view me as good because I can find a third cousin who gave a performance at Carnegie Hall. And that is, you're not trying to treat this person bad. He says, you should treat me good. Look at my cousins, what they did and so on. And that's as perverse as treating the person in a negative way because of what their cousins did. So racism is ascribing significance to a characteristic that and a genetic characteristic that you have no business ascribing significance to. And it's not essentially that it's negative.
We have a $20 donation from Adam Reed. He says, consider U.S. government school lunches high in inducing low fiber carbohydrates, resulting in high rates of diabetes in low income population. Is this a result of systemic racism in U.S. government programs? If not, why not? My quick and easy answer would be no, because you would have to substantiate how this disparity is connected back to race within law itself.
If I may, I think this one is trying to connect to. I've heard the point that because most of public schools are filled with, I guess Black students. I guess is this, and then Black students. Oh, poor schools. Yeah, and then because that affects their health rates, and then you look at health statistics. I've seen this kind of thing where they put together all these statistics to then say, well, look at these bad things that are happening. And then he's saying, would this not be systemic racism?
Yeah. And it's again, the issue is that you have to link the cause and effect to have a full view. And if you think of the government's whole involvement in nutrition, it's corrupt in various kinds of ways about what gets subsidized and what does, like the whole sugar industry is subsidized in a certain way in the US, but also the whole food pyramid that was constructed and what was proper and improper to eat. When you look at it, it didn't have a lot of scientific backing to it. And so, but it was government instituted. So this is a government instituted policy. And you might think it's really bad, but that doesn't show that the reasons it was instituted were for racial reasons.
There's something you said there that was cause. You said cause and effect, and you don't have to. I know this is a big one, but you don't have to take a lot of time. Just, is there anything you could say real quick about cause and effect when thinking about cause and effect and human actions? Like because you say we got to think about cause and effect, but we're talking about the kind of this nuanced topic of cause and effect between what humans do. How do we properly look at that?
I mean, you have to think about the ideas, values, norms that are governing actual people. And as we talked about, that doesn't always mean that they're explicit, but you still have to have evidence for thinking this idea or value the person holds, even though it might not be explicit, he doesn't explicitly articulate it and so on. But you need evidence to think this is an idea that is actually operative in the person's mind. And you can't just assert it. Like, you need to think, what's the evidence for this? And that is part, in terms of thinking of causality for human beings, that you have to think about what is actually going on inside their head. What are they thinking? And so, and it won't always be explicit, but it can't be that you have no view about that, because then you're not actually understanding the phenomenon. Human beings are governed by their ideas and their values and norms, both explicit and implicit.
And then again, to put in the same thing that Thomas Sowell makes, right? It's the variables amongst these two different subjects here when we're talking about, black and white disparities or whatever. The questions that need to be asked, well, is it caused because people aren't working out? What are they eating at home? What type of, well, we already know they're poor, but like those are the questions that needs to be asked, and it can't automatically be attributed to just government policy alone. There's internal choices that kids can make too that affects these disparities as well. Wyatt with Wyatt 516 with a $5 donation, he says, if racism is the worst thing one could be falsely accused of today, does justice call for hating for those who use the tactic to shut down debate?
This is a good closing one too.
It calls for a negative evaluation, I think, but that's not always hatred. And just, we talked a little bit about there can be different motivations for this, and including like on the spectrum of not good motivations. So there can be people, and I really do think there are people now who are using this as a weapon, that they know it can shut down people. They use it to intimidate and to silence when they know they have no business doing it. They're not actually winning the argument. They're just terrorizing people. They're too afraid to speak out and have the kind of social ostracism that will have, whether it's on social media or an act, like they get fired from a company and so on. So, but there are people who are jumping on that bandwagon, not fully realizing what they're doing. Like they think they're fighting for justice, but they're actually treating people very unjustly. And often I think of that person, like what you're doing is not good. It's not at the level of like you fully consciously know what you're doing. But if you gave it some more thought, you might think that there's something that I'm doing is wrong. Like even just people act differently on social media than they do in real life. That they would never say this to somebody's face to face, but they feel kind of immune and they'll do it and they'll jump on some, whether it's Twitter or Facebook, attacking someone, whereas they would think twice before doing it if they had to really confront the person. And that, like, I have a negative judgment of that. You should be able to think twice on social media as well. But they don't. But that's not the same as like what they deserve is hatred. So you have to think about what the person's actually doing and what degree of culpability is going on there.
Perfect answer. I'll say to close us out on that one. Yeah, on a personal note, I run into a lot of people. This topic gets me very heated, and I run into a lot of people. And one of the things I stress to remember myself is that not each person that I meet who's kind of gone up in this topic, and this topic creates so many confusions and stuff. They're not a bad person. Some people are genuinely confused. They're genuinely trying to figure out, as you described, a real phenomena that is a problem. And sometimes you just gotta, that's kind of what we're fighting to do here. Present proper ideas and proper ways of thinking about these things that will help. And what's good about the truth and being on the side of truth and reality is that it will help those kind of derivative issues that then cause even more negative things, that misconceptualization that causes negative reactions. It's kind of as a domino. When you start with a fundamental change, such as individualism to these topics like this, it can bring so much. So, and that's where I'll end there. Will you take us out?
Well, all right, guys, that has been episode 7 of Method in Madness with my colleague Ibis, and my professor Onkar Ghate. You can check us out every single Monday, and we will see you guys next episode.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks.